We're going to finish up the book of Nehemiah this evening, beginning at chapter 11. We'll be looking at chapters 11, 12, and 13. I'll be with you this week and next week. I normally teach the young adult class in the back on Wednesdays, but we've brought that class in here while Dad's out of town. So we'll finish up Nehemiah this week and then introduce the book of Esther next week and look at chapters 1 and 2. So we'll go through, I know Dad goes through chapter titles with y'all out here, and I do the same in my class. Now these are probably going to be a little bit different chapter titles. Some of them may be the same. I don't know. I've used some of his titles and outlines, and I'm not sure which one. So don't worry about it if you say something and it's not word for word what's up here. So what did we see in Nehemiah chapter 1? All right, we called that in our class Nehemiah's response to bad news. He got bad news, a bad report about the condition of things in Jerusalem. It was under distress and reproach. So that was Nehemiah's response to bad news. Chapter 2, what did we see? All right, Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem. Remember, what was Nehemiah's occupation? He was the cupbearer for the king. We learned that at the end of chapter 1, and that's why he had such a close relationship with the king and was able to request and grant and be granted permission to return to Jerusalem. Chapter 3, what do we see? Those who worked on the wall, the builders of the wall, listed each man that was responsible for each section of the wall and each family that was responsible for what section. Chapter 4. Yes, opposition from the enemies, opposition to Nehemiah from without. That opposition that we saw from Sanballat and Tobiah and others, but those were the two main ones. Chapter 5, kind of the flip side of that, not opposition from without, but what? From within. Opposition from within are problems that Nehemiah had to deal with from within, with the Jewish brethren not treating one another fairly. Chapter... Lost my place. Chapter 6. Yes, opposition from the enemies. The enemies, some of the enemies are defeated, and the wall is finally completed. Took them how long? 52 days. Quite an accomplishment to complete that. Chapter 7. All right, securing and repopulating of Jerusalem. We're going to kind of pick that up as we get into chapter 11 this evening. Chapter 8. All right, Ezra's preparation for renewing the covenant, and he read the law to them, and some changes. They found some changes that they needed to make and things they've been doing. Chapter 9, confession of sins, and he also reviews their history and how they had sinned and how their fathers had sinned throughout their history. And finally, chapter 10. All right, we saw the sealing and the signing of the documents and the obligations that they had towards the covenant that they made in chapter 10. So we'll get on into chapter 11. As I've told my class that some of these chapters, for lack of a better term, are a little more exciting than others. Chapter 11 would be one of those a little more difficult to glean a lot of practical application out of it. Very important from a historical standpoint. So we'll probably go a little faster through chapter 11 and through much of chapter 12 and spend the bulk of our time in chapter 13 this evening, hopefully, if I time things the way I'm planning. But question number 1, if you have your questions, somebody give us a summary of chapter 11.
It's a list of those dwelling in Jerusalem.
Okay. And this is directly, I'm sorry, I didn't show you this outline. I know this is also a little bit different than what y'all have been looking at out here, but we've been following this outline from Roper, the commitment to rebuilding the wall in Jerusalem, 1 through 7, commitment to renewing the covenant, 8 through 13. Here's an alternate outline from Wiersbe. He keeps it simple. Concern, construction, conflict, consecration, and cleansing, finally in chapter 13. Now, Shannon, say that again for chapter 11.
A list of those dwelling in Jerusalem.
All right. And this is directly linked, if you back up a few chapters to chapter 7, remember the problem that Nehemiah had to deal with in chapter 7 in verse 4. And what was that problem? Yeah, chapter 7, verse 4 says, "Now the city was large and spacious, but the people in it were few, and the houses were not rebuilt." Now, you may think, what's the big deal about that? That they have a city and there's just not a lot of people in it. So what would be the issue with that? What would be the problem? Yes, exactly. Defense. The city, they've just completed this wall, and if there's hardly anybody in the city, it could be easily overtaken. So for safety purposes, this was the epicenter of the Jewish worship where they're worshiping in the temple, and they needed to do so in safety. And without the city being populated, they could not do that in safety. So it is an important thing for them to repopulate it. And so back in chapter 7, Nehemiah decided to take a census, and he found an old census from where Zerubbabel, they had returned under Zerubbabel under the first return, and he's going to use that to repopulate Jerusalem. So we see here in beginning of chapter 11, the first two verses, that Jerusalem is repopulated. How did they go about repopulating Jerusalem? All right, verse 1 tells us that the casting of lots, and one out of every 10 people, so 10%. So I'm not sure exactly how the casting of lot process would have gone, but nonetheless, 10% of the people were required to come and live in Jerusalem. But in addition to that, there were also some in verse 2 who did not come by the casting of lots, but what? They volunteered. They did so willingly in verse 2. So there were a small handful of people who volunteered themselves to return to Jerusalem, but the rest of them, 10% of the people, were required by the casting of lots to come and to populate Jerusalem, again, for their safety. So that's verses 1 through 2. We'll probably go a little bit quicker through the rest of this chapter. Verses 3 through 24 gives a list of those who lived in Jerusalem, those who were, I suppose this is probably both of those who volunteered and those who came by this draft or by the casting of lots. But we're going to see a lot of names mentioned here. But beginning at verse 3, we see the heads of the provinces who came. Verses 4 through 9 talks about Judah and Benjamin, which those were the two tribes that made up the southern kingdom of Judah. Verse 6 tells us how many came from Judah. 468 at the end of verse 6. And it calls these valiant men, again suggesting that perhaps these people were brought there for the defense of the city. Because again, we see that term, or a little bit different term, but down in verse 14 it says, "Their brethren, mighty men of valor." Many of these would have been warriors and mighty men of valor to protect the city. So we see 468 from Judah in verse 6. Verse 8 tells us how many came from Benjamin. 928 from the tribe of Benjamin were selected to live in the city of Jerusalem. Verse 9, two men are mentioned, Joel and Judah, and they are simply listed as their overseers. I'm not sure what their duty would have been other than they were in some way put in charge of these 468 and 928 men. They were just called overseers or leaders there in verse 9. So that gets us down through verse 9. Verses 10 through 14 begins to list the priest. And beginning at verse 10, again, we won't read through all these names, but it goes down into verse 12 and tells how many priests were there? 822 who performed the work of the temple there in verse 12. Going on down in verse 13, there were 242 kinsmen who were chosen to come. In verse 14, this is where it mentions those valiant men. Verse 14 says, "And their brethren, mighty men of valor, were 128. Some translations say that these were their brothers. You may have a translation there, it says brothers instead of brethren. And the overseer of them in verse 14 was Zabdiel. Again, don't know the significance of these overseers, but for whatever reason, they were put in charge over this group of people. So that's the priests that returned, 10 through 14. Verses 15 through 23, we see the Levites, the gatekeepers, the temple servants. You've seen the term Nethinim quite a few times through the book of Nehemiah. Those are temple servants. So this is verses 15 through 23. Verse 18 tells us there were 284 that were brought to the holy city. Verse 19 tells us there were 172 gatekeepers. And what do we learn in verses 20 and 21? That not all of the Levites came to Jerusalem, right? Yes, there were some who dwelt outside the city. Verse 20, and the rest of Israel, of the priests and the Levites, were in the cities of Judah, everyone to his own inheritance. But the Nethinim, there's that term Nethinim, verse 21, they dwelt in Ophel, and Zehah and Gishphah were over the Nethinim. So there's leaders that are mentioned over them as well. Verses 22 and 23, we see the overseers of the Levites are mentioned there as well. Uzziah, the son of Asaph, was the overseer of the Levites. I know we're going through this rather quickly, but we're hopefully going to get to chapter 13. The king's representative is mentioned in verse 24. Again, much like these other leaders or overseers that are mentioned, I'm not sure what the role of this man would have been. But verse 24, it mentions Pethahiah. It says that he was the king's deputy in all matters concerning the people. He was some type of ambassador, I guess you would say, between the Jews and the Persians. But he also dwelt there, and he was called the king's deputy, or the king's representative in verse 24. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Very true. Yeah, and we see a lot of the singers that are mentioned tonight, particularly as we get into the dedication of the wall as well. Good point. All right, verses 25 through 36. We'll finish this chapter up. This just lists the cities in which they dwelt, in which everyone else dwelt. That 10% and those who volunteered came and dwelt in Jerusalem. Verses 25 through 35 lists the other cities in which they had populated as well. The cities of Judah are listed in verses 25 through 30, and it kind of sums it up at the end of verse 30. It says, they dwelt from Beersheba to the valley of Hinnom. So Beersheba would be down south Judah, to the valley of Hinnom would have been right up next to the city of Jerusalem, roughly about 100 miles apart. So those who dwelt in Jerusalem or in Judah lived as far as 100 miles away from Jerusalem. So not everyone obviously dwelt in Jerusalem. I like this quote, and I'll share this with you. Why were these cities listed? Again, as I mentioned, this is not the most exciting chapter to read through, but verses 25 through 36 just gives a list of cities. And what would have been the author's purpose in that? One thing, point number one here, to perhaps prove that to the people how widespread they were. As I mentioned, some of them lived as much as 100 miles away from the epicenter, from Jerusalem there. But also, I like this quote from Roper that kind of perhaps sums this section up and perhaps this whole chapter. He says, to the writer's immediate audience, the message was, the Jews are back. They are now living throughout the land that God had originally given to Israel, and this would encourage the Jews and make them realize that the nation of Israel had indeed been restored. Being in this place, no doubt, awakened their memories and refreshed their spirits. Reminded them of the way things used to be, and as he says, awakened their memories and refreshed their spirits. So perhaps that's the reason. This is very important from a historical standpoint, and that would have been very, very encouraging to the immediate audience. Anything else on chapter 11? All right. Let's look back at our questions here. Number 2, somebody give us a summary of chapter 12. Okay. Priests and Levites return. What else we see in chapter 12?
Nehemiah dedicates the wall.
All right, the dedication of the wall. So we see the priestly service and the dedication of the wall from chapter 12. Again, these first 25 verses are kind of going to be a lot of list of names. When we pick up at verse 27 through the remainder of the book, we'll hopefully get a little more practical application out of this. Verses 1 through 26 is the service of the priest and the Levites, and he kind of goes through a history of the original priests and Levites that came back with Zerubbabel. In chapter 12 and verse 1, he begins to talk about those who returned with Zerubbabel, and then he goes all the way up to the end of verse 26, mentioning those who were at the time of Nehemiah himself. So he goes back roughly about 100 years. It had been about 100 years since Zerubbabel had led that first group. So he starts with them saying, these are the priests and the Levites who returned with him, and here's their lineage, and this is how it leads up to our present day, to the time of Nehemiah and Ezra, proving that the present day priests and Levites were of the lineage of those who originally returned from Babylon, I think is the point of verses 1 through 26. So again, we won't take the time and get bogged down in all these names, but priests are mentioned verses 1 through 7. Levites are mentioned verses 8 and 9. Again, those are those who returned with Zerubbabel. Beginning at verse 10, we see the succession of the high priest. We will read those names because we're going to see Elisha brought back up again. Verse 10 says, Jeshua begot Joachim, Joachim begot Eliashib, and Elisha begot Joiada, Joiada begot Jonathan, Jonathan begot Jaddua. That's the lineage of the high priest in verses 10 and 11. The heads of the priest are mentioned in verses 12 through 21. And we had a question here on this next section. Question number 5. What records had been kept during the reign of Darius? All right, yes, verses 22 and 23, records of the heads of the priests and the heads of the Levites. And those are the ones that are mentioned in verses 12 through 21, also in verses 24 through 26. So that's all I have to bring out on those first 26 verses. It just starts with from the time they returned to Zerubbabel all the way up to the present day of Nehemiah, and showed the lineage and how they got there. The present day priests are from the same lineage of those who originally returned. I did want to point something out that's not necessarily related to what we see in those verses. In verse 24, we see the name David mentioned. And I find it interesting in chapter 12 that the name David is mentioned 6 times in chapter 12. Verse 24 talks about David, the man of God. Verse 36, David, the man of God. Verse 37, the city of David. Also in verse 37, the house of David. Verse 45 talks about the command of David. And verse 46 talks about the days of David. And I took this from a commentator as well. He says this is the point, or a point that they could have taken from this. What was happening on this occasion was reminiscent of the glorious days of David's kingdom. Remember talking about why mention all those cities? It would remind them of the former days. And he mentions David 6 times, things that happened because of David being a man of God, things that David commanded that God had him do. Would have been reminiscent of those days. So I think I just find that interesting how many times he mentions David here. And he's restoring the kingdom. Even though the kingdom would not be what it once was under David, he's still restoring the kingdom much like it was in the days of David. All right, picking up at verse 27, this is where we're going to get into a little bit more meat, beginning at verse 27 on through the remainder of the book. We see Nehemiah dedicating the wall, the dedication of the wall, verses 27 through 43. We see that preparations are made in verses 27 through 30. The Levites are gathered in verses 27 through 29, and they are getting ready to celebrate. Verse 27 says, Now at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites in all the places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, both with thanksgiving and singing and cymbals and stringed instruments and harps. They're about to have a celebration. That's what the dedication is. They're celebrating the fact that this wall has been completed, that God has been with them in order for them to accomplish this. Now, I'm not 100% sure, I'm not any percent sure of how long it has been since the completion of the wall. I take it that there has been some gap of time, but how large a gap of time that is. Because the wall was completed all the way back in chapter 6, we know. And I know a lot of these events may not necessarily be in chronological order, but since then they have rededicated themselves to the covenant. Chapter 10, they had the reading of the law in chapter 8 that led to that renewing of the covenant. So I take it that some time has passed. How much time that is, I'm not sure. But nonetheless, they are ready to celebrate the completion of this wall. And so they prepare for the celebration, and in verse 30, what else do they do in preparation for this dedication? All right, they purify themselves, they purify the people, Purified the gates, purified the wall. I take it that's ceremonial purification. I don't know, perhaps the sprinkling of water on the gates and on the walls, but a ceremonial purification took place before they could dedicate this wall and celebrate its completion. Verses 31 through 39, we see two processions that are going to be led. One is going to be led by Ezra, verses 31 through 37. Second will be led by Nehemiah in verses 38 and 39. They're going to walk around the top of the wall. Look at verse 31. It says, "So I brought the leaders of Judah up on the wall." Oftentimes when we think of a wall like we have in this building that's not wide enough to walk on. This was a very wide wall, wide enough that they could have ridden horses and chariots across the wall. I read somewhere where most of the wall would have probably been about 9 foot wide, and in some places it would have been even much wider than that. So they are actually up on the wall, verse 31. "So I brought the leaders up on the wall." And I know Dad has showed you this because I got it from him. But just to kind of give you a visual, an idea, most likely when they began this procession, they began right here at the Valley Gate, because it's going to talk about one group comes out and comes towards the Dung Gate and the Fountain Gate and comes around. That's the group led by Ezra, I believe. They're going counterclockwise around the city. Nehemiah and his group is going to come clockwise around the city from the Valley Gate and past the Tower of Ovens and the Old Gate. So they're going opposite directions and eventually going to meet up here at the top when they get back to the temple. And that's where the celebration is going to take place. So verse am I looking for? At the end of verse 36 is where we see Ezra led this first group. A bunch of names are mentioned at the end of verse 26. It says, Ezra the scribe went before them by the Fountain Gate, which is down here in the south. This is Ezra's group come by the Fountain Gate, verse 37. The stairway of the city of David, it's right down here at the very, very point. That's mentioned in verse 37. And they came up by the water gate, which is over here on the east side. So Ezra's group is coming counterclockwise. Beginning at verse 38, it says, "The other Thanksgiving choir went the opposite way, and I was behind them with half of the people on the wall, going past the Tower of the Ovens," listed here. Tower of the Ovens in verse 38. The broad wall, right here, this black dotted line would have been where the broad wall, that's where the wall would have been much wider. I think it was like 23 feet wide at that point. And it goes on talking in verse 39, they passed the gate of Ephraim, the old gate, the fish gate, and the Tower of the Hundreds, and you can see all those listed there as well. So the point is, as part of their celebration and marching towards the temple, Ezra took one group, Nehemiah took another group. They went opposite directions, and they're going to meet at the temple. Now, what happens when they finally meet at the temple? Verses 40 through 43. What do?
They offered sacrifices and they rejoiced. They had great joy.
Yes. We see the ceremony. The two groups finally meet at the temple in verse 40. And it was such as Shannon mentioned there, the sacrifices and great joy. And it was such a joyous occasion and so loud that, how's it described at the end of verse 43? Yes, it says, "With great joy the women and the children also rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard afar off." This was no small celebration, was heard afar off. So this was quite the celebration that they had of dedicating this wall and praising God for allowing them to complete this wall. So they meet at the temple and have that ceremony, verses 40 through 43. 44 through 47 talks about provisions that would to be made for the priest and the Levites, tithes that were to be given to provide for them. We saw that last week in chapter 10, and we're actually going to see it again in the next chapter, chapter 13. So we won't spend much time on it here. But verses 44 and 47 talks about how the priests were to be provided for. That was part of part of the old law through tithes that were to be given. And we see in verses 45 and 46 the reason for that. The reason that was to take place was because, one thing, they had been given charge by God. Another thing, according, this is the phrase that we saw a while ago at the end of verse 45, according to the command of David. They were commanded by King David to do so, and Solomon his son as well. In verse 46, for in the days of David and Asaph of old, there were chiefs and singers and the songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. So these priests and Levites were to be provided for, and we see why they were to be provided for. Chapter 13, we're going to see they have an issue with that, of them not being provided for the way that they should have. Any other comments on chapter 12? I'm hoping if we have time at the end, we'll come back and talk about some practical things that perhaps we learn. All right, last chapter of the book, chapter 13. What's chapter 13 about? All right, final reforms. I call this the enforcing of the covenant, or final reforms that they're going to make. Remember last week, chapter 10, they made a covenant. They obviously didn't keep that covenant very long because Nehemiah is already going to have to deal with the very things that they made a covenant about in chapter 10. They're already breaking that covenant, and he's going to have to deal with that in this chapter. So this is the enforcing of the covenant. Nehemiah is going to have to be quite forceful with them when they have broken the covenant, and quite forceful with them in making some of these reforms. We'll see that as we go throughout this. Let's look at our questions. There's 5 different problems that Nehemiah is having to deal with. First one is in verses 1 through 3. Question number 6, what problem is Nehemiah addressing in these verses? All right, the foreigners were excluded from the assembly of God, particularly what 2 nations are mentioned? Ammonites and the Moabites. And why are those 2 singled out?
Their history, the Ammonites and Moabites, the way they treated them when they wanted to pass through the land, and they hired, Balaam to prophesy against him. Yes, very good. So it says in verse 1 that they were reading from the law. Most likely they were reading here from Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 through 6, which talks about this. No foreigner should come into the assembly of God, and particularly he mentions the Ammonites and the Moabites here. And the reason for that is that they had not shown them hospitality during the time of the Exodus, but instead, as Shannon mentioned, they hired Balaam to try to curse the Israelites, ended up backfiring on them. They ended up blessing them instead of cursing them. We know the story of Balaam from the book of Numbers as well. So I take it that they were probably reading from that portion of Scripture there, from Deuteronomy chapter 23, seeing that they needed to exclude themselves from these foreigners. And after reading that, what did they do in verse 3? They did exactly what it said. That should be our reaction when we read something in the Scriptures and we're not doing that. It says, so it was when they heard the law that they separated themselves from the mixed multitude of Israel. They did exactly what they were supposed to do on this occasion. So that's the first problem that Nehemiah has to deal with in enforcing the covenant, separating themselves from the Ammonites and the Moabites because of what they had done. And they should have well known that because Ezra had to deal with them with the pagan marriages and the problems that came with that. They were influenced by these other nations, much the same way they could have easily been influenced by the Ammonites and the Moabites. All right, pick up in verse 4, question number 7. What's the next problem that Nehemiah has to deal with? Okay, so our next section, verses 4 through 29, are going to be more of Nehemiah's reforms. We're going to see four such reforms in this section. The room of the temple is cleansed, and that is because Eliashib had profaned it by giving a room to Tobiah, one of the enemies of the Jewish people, one of the main 2 who are mentioned, Sanballat and Tobiah.
mentioned as being enemies of God's people and trying to stop the building of the wall. I find it interesting that now here's the high priest who's making an alliance with the enemy of God's people. And not only just the high priest, flip back to chapter 3. Chapter 3 and verse 1, this Eliashib, the high priest, was one of the first ones that is mentioned as taking part in building the wall. It says, then Eliashib, the high priest, rose up, and his brethren the priests, and they built the sheep gate, and they consecrated and hung it, and talked about what portion of the wall he was responsible for. So he had been in opposition to Tobiah because Tobiah was trying to stop work on the wall. Eliashib was working on the wall, but now they seem to have made some sort of an alliance here in chapter 13. And he had given him a room. For what purpose, I'm not sure, other than perhaps when he came into Jerusalem, perhaps for business, he just gave him a place to stay. What's interesting is Tobiah, anybody remember where he was from? He was an Ammonite, chapter 2 and verse 10. So Nehemiah has just dealt with them of separating from the Moabites and the Ammonites. And then he comes back to the temple and finds that there's an Ammonite living in the temple. Kind of interesting that he just had to deal with that and now comes back and he finds that very thing. Where was Nehemiah during this time? Yes, verse 6. It says, but during all of this, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king, and after certain days I obtained leave from the king. We know from back in chapter 2 and verse 6 that when Nehemiah got permission from Artaxerxes to come to Jerusalem, they agreed upon a set time. Not sure what that set time was, other than we know it was a period of 12 years. So whether or not he returned early, we don't know. But we know Nehemiah stayed in Jerusalem for 12 years. He saw the completion of the wall. And then he returned. How long did he return for? We're not told. So as we read through this, it looks like chapter 10, they make a covenant. And then just a couple chapters later, they're right back into committing the same sins that they had just made a covenant they were not going to. There could potentially be a gap of time up to 10 years between chapter 10 and between now, because King Artaxerxes reigns until the time now, you might write out to the side of verse 6, it's now 433 BC. Artaxerxes would reign until 423 BC. So he could have stayed up until the end of Artaxerxes' reign. We're not told. We don't know how long he returned to Jerusalem. So it looks like the Israelites made a covenant and immediately broke that covenant. But there could have been quite a bit of a gap of time in between that. Again, possibly up to 10 years. We don't know for sure. But nonetheless, Nehemiah was gone. And when he comes back is when he finds all these issues, such as this room in the temple that needs to be cleansed. Verses 7 through 9, what does Nehemiah do to solve this problem? Yes, he threw everything out. When he found that this evil that was done, verse 8 says, and it grieved me bitterly. Therefore I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room, and I commanded them to cleanse the rooms, and I brought them back into the temple. And I brought back into them the articles of the house of God with grain offering and frankincense. So these were rooms that were used to store things for sacrifices, and they had evidently cleared the room out so Tobiah could have a place to stay. So he restores it back to the way that it should have been. He kicks Tobiah out of the temple. Yes? Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't just one of them, they were fighting with the enemy's trail.
Yes. In fact, that's the end of chapter 13. Chapter 13, verse 28. We'll get to that when he deals with the pagan marriages. But yes, both of them had some sort of alliance with Tobiah or with Elisha. That's interesting. Good point. Anything else on Nehemiah cleansing the temple? All right, question number 8. What's the next problem that Nehemiah has to deal with? Yes, this is what we he had just mentioned at the end of chapter 12, this is how the Levites were to be provided for. And so the next issue that he has to deal with is, let me get my notes straight here, is tithes for the temple and how the workers were not being provided for. Beginning at verse 10, he says, "And I also realized that the portions for the Levites had not been given them, for each of the Levites and the singers who did the work had gone back to his field." And I like this phrase in verse 11. We're going to see this again, or a couple more times. "So I contended with the rulers." I contended with the rulers. ESV, I believe, says, "I confronted the rulers. And I said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their place. And then Judah brought the tithe and the grain and the new wine and the oil for the storehouse." Now, this was something that they had made. This was part of the covenant that they had made in chapter 10. And how soon they forgot. Chapter 10, verses 34 through 39. Again, there could have been a little bit of gap of time in between that. So what's Nehemiah's solution? We saw that he contended with them in verse 11. But as we get down into verse 13 in particular, what's Nehemiah's solution to solving this problem? Yes. He delegated, a sign of a good leader. Verse 13, "And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouse." All those names are mentioned, and he chose those men because, why? They were considered faithful. That's what it says at the end of verse 13. They were considered faithful, and their task was to distribute to their brethren. So he, again, a sign of a good leader. He delegated to others. Here's what we need to do to solve this problem. What's Nehemiah's request, wrapping up this section here in verse 14? After he has just, for lack of a better term, he's just solved a problem for the people. What does he say? Yes. "Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds." There's nothing wrong with asking God to remember your good deeds. That's not an arrogant attitude. He realizes that he's doing the work of the Lord. "Remember me, O my God." He's going to say that 3 times. He'll say it again in verse 22 and again in verse 31. To remember me, O my God. He was more concerned about what God thought about him and more concerned about being approved in the eyes of God than he was his fellow man. "Remember me, O my God, and the things that I have done." All right, beginning at verse 15, question number 9. What's the next problem that Nehemiah is dealing with? Yes, they were not observing the Sabbath properly, and so he's going to enforce the Sabbath. The people were conducting regular business on the Sabbath, and for time's sake, I'm going to pick up the pace through this section. Nehemiah rebukes them. Again, we see that phrase in verse 17 when they were conducting just common business on the Sabbath. He says in verse 17, "Then I contended with the nobles," or "I confronted the nobles." He jumped down to verse 21, "And I warned them." So his solution, he gives a solution in verses 19 through 22. He commanded that the gates were to be closed, the gates were to be locked, where they could not conduct this business. And he warned them. And he even warns them in verse 21 that if you do so again, I'm going to lay hands on you, in verse 21. And we'll see later in verse 25, he even does things that we might consider even more harsh to them. But he ends this section again in verse 22, second half of verse 22. "Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and spare me according to your greatness and your mercy." God, remember me for the good that I have done. Finally, verses 23 through 29, mixed marriages forbidden. He deals with the pagan marriages, the very same thing that Ezra had to deal with back in Ezra chapters 9 and 10. The pagan marriages, marrying those of the land. He says again in verse 25, when he's confronted with this problem, "I contended with them." So that's 3 times. Verse 25, if you haven't marked those, verse 25, verse 17, and verse 11. I contended with them. There are times when we may have to contend with people who are in sin. That's what Nehemiah did. And he didn't just contend with them. What else does he do in verse 25? Kind of gets rough with them, doesn't he? Yeah, I contended with them, I cursed them, I struck some of them and pulled out their hair. You may have a footnote at verse 25 that says, I pronounced a curse on them. Not that he cursed them in the sense that we might think of it today, but I pronounced a curse on them. But anyways, struck them, pulled out their hair. There's a lot of question as to, did Nehemiah go overboard here? Was Nehemiah just lashing out just because of his anger? And was he justified? Some say that he was not justified and he's to be condemned for these actions. I tend to think that Nehemiah was justified in his actions for three reasons. One is he was never condemned for those actions. We have no record of that. Number two, Nehemiah was not only a spiritual leader. He was a government official. He was the governor. His job, part of his job as governor, was to enforce the law of the land. And what law was that? What law are they under? They're under the law of Moses, right? His job, part of his job as governor, is to enforce that. And so he's not just a spiritual leader, although he is a spiritual leader. He's not only a spiritual leader, he is a civil leader as well. He's a government official, and his job was to enforce the law. Thirdly, I think perhaps that makes the point perhaps the best, is that oftentimes in God's law, punishment for violating the law was quite harsh. For instance, a fornicator, if you were found to be a fornicator or an adulterer, what was to happen to you? Be stoned to death. If you were a child who had disobeyed your parent, under the Old Testament law in the book of Leviticus, talks about stoning the child. Quite harsh. So when we look at what Nehemiah did to them, he struck them and pulled their hair. It's quite mild compared to some of the other consequences that we might read of in the Old Testament.
And I read one commentary said that may also reference the shaving of the head as part of the discipline.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Right. No, that's a good point. Just as part of the punishment for their sin. Yes. To bring shame upon them for that. So Nehemiah, he does get quite harsh with them by today's standards, but under the Old Testament law, that really wasn't that harsh. Yes. Yeah.
And these were the children of the people he did the first time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, they should have learned the lesson, and they didn't. And beginning at verse 26, who does he bring up as an example? Solomon. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? These pagan wives brought Solomon down. Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. If you don't have this underlined or marked in your Bible, you probably should. Nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. Even Solomon in all of his wisdom, and even Solomon in all of his glory that God had made him king over Israel, even it caused him to sin. Nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. Basically, learn your lesson and take heed lest you fall, is what he's telling these people. That if you think you can marry pagan wives and stand strong, Solomon himself could not do that. So take heed lest you fall. Verses 28 and 29 finishes up this section. Nehemiah drove out a particular offender. It's what Diane was mentioning earlier. This was a son-in-law of Eliashib, or a descendant of Eliashib had married Sanballat's daughter, and he drove out that particular offender there in verse 28. And then he concludes this section, verse 29. He doesn't say, remember me, but remember who? Remember them. Remember them for their sin. God, don't forget their sin. They need to be punished for their sin. So long as they're living in their sin, remember them. And then finally, verses 30 through 31, he gives a concluding summary and prayer, which he concludes again at the end of verse 31. Remember me, O my God, for good. We'll stop right there. Sorry we didn't have time for practical lessons, but we'll begin the book of Esther next week and look at chapters 1 and 2.